Hey guys, tonight, we're descending into one of the most unsettling true hauntings ever documented. A place where grief, illness, and death collided with something far older and darker. Imagine a house that breathes under your feet, where the walls pulse with memories that aren't yours and the shadows never seem to stay where they belong. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The house was old, not in the charming antique sense, but in a tired way, as if it had endured too many lives and deaths without pause. Perched on a quiet street in Southington, Connecticut, the white colonial looked harmless at a glance. But as Carmen Snedeker stepped out of her car with her teenage son, she felt a pressure in her chest, like the air itself pushed back against her lungs. It was March 1986. Her son, Philip, had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, and this house was conveniently located near the hospital where he would begin an aggressive treatment regimen. Carmen wanted to be hopeful. But something about the house, it was the way it stood, not dilapidated, but too still, kept her from smiling. They were desperate. Hospital bills, travel, food, it added up. This place with its cheap rent and extra space seemed like a miracle. Inside, the floors creaked under their steps in a way that didn't feel random. Carmen noticed the smell immediately. Not rot, not mildew, but something metallic and cold like rusted iron. She told herself it was probably old pipes. The landlord was eager to leave. He had barely finished showing them around before handing over the keys. He made no mention of the house's past. It wasn't until days later, unpacking boxes in the basement, that Carmen found the cold room. It was behind a heavy wooden door off the laundry area, one that stuck in its frame. When she managed to shove it open, a sharp draft met her. The room had no windows, just thick tile walls, a metal gurney against one side, and a built-in drain in the center of the floor. For a long moment, Carmen couldn't move. Something in her blood remembered this room before her mind did. She pulled the door shut and walked upstairs without a word. Philip was the first to change. He was exhausted all the time, but that was expected with chemotherapy. What wasn't expected were the night terrors. He'd bolt upright, gasping, insisting someone had been in his room, touching him, whispering from the ceiling. He wasn't the only one. The younger children complained of voices coming through the vents. Once Carmen found her niece staring at the wall of the bathroom, unblinking, muttering to herself. When asked what she was doing, the girl answered, "He told me to be quiet." Carmen brushed it off. Children had imaginations. The stress of Philip's illness was affecting them all. Still, the air in the house grew thicker by the week. One night, Carmen woke with the feeling that someone was watching her. The house was silent, but the silence pressed in around her dense as fog. She sat up and caught a glimpse of movement, something pulling back into the dark at the end of the hallway. But when she stood to check, there was nothing there. She began finding the crucifix over her bed turned upside down. The first time she thought it had fallen. The second time she used a nail. The third time, she said nothing. Philip got worse. Not just physically, his moods darkened. He became violent, even toward his cousins. He claimed the voices told him things, terrible things, things about the house, that there had been bodies, that people had been cut open in the basement, that they never left. Carmen confronted the landlord. He hesitated before finally admitting the truth. Yes, the house had once been a funeral home. The basement was a mortuary. The cold room had held the dead. Embalming fluid had been stored in the walls. She wanted to move out, but the doctors warned that Philip couldn't be relocated mid-treatment. They were stuck. So she began to listen to the house. It creaked in patterns. the shadows didn't behave like they should. She'd sweep one corner of the kitchen only to find footprints in flour she hadn't spilled. Once, she turned off the lights at midnight. At 3:00 a.m., every light in the house was on. One evening alone in the kitchen, Carmen heard whispering, soft, persistent, almost chanting. She turned, expecting one of the children. The room was empty, but the temperature had dropped. Her breath hung in the air like mist. A drawer opened behind her, slowly, deliberately. Inside was a long, embalming scalpel, one she didn't recognize. She left it there, shut the drawer, and backed away. The house had many rooms, and each held its own silence. But it was the basement that grew louder, more demanding, like a heartbeat in the floor. And Carmen was beginning to suspect. It didn't just want them gone. It wanted to be remembered. By the second month, the house had settled into its rhythm, a quiet that wasn't peaceful, but waiting. The kind of silence that listens back. Carmen began to keep a journal, though she never intended to share it. She filled its pages at night, seated in the dim kitchen light, writing out every strange occurrence as if documenting them could somehow rob them of their power. It was on one of these nights, when the wind outside had died and the house had grown oppressively still, that Carmen heard the dragging sound. It started faintly, like fabric brushing the walls. Then it grew louder, a low scrape, something heavy being pulled across the floor just above her. But everyone else was asleep. She stood slowly, heart thudding, and crept upstairs. Philip's door was ajar. Inside the room was dim lit only by the glow of the hallway. He sat upright in bed, eyes wide but unfocused, staring at the far corner of the ceiling. Carmen stepped closer. "Philip." He didn't respond. His lips were moving, whispering, but the words didn't make sense. Guttural syllables that rolled like a language not meant for the living. Carmen reached out, touched his shoulder. Philip blinked, then shuddered. "They're pulling him down," he whispered. "They keep saying his skin's not ready." Carmen froze. "Who?" she asked softly. Philip shook his head. "Not who. What?" She stayed in his room the rest of the night, afraid to close her eyes. The next day, she reached out to the hospital psychologist. They chalked it up to medication side effects, stress. Carmen didn't argue. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that. In the following days, things escalated. Mattresses were found, overturned chairs, moved themselves while no one was looking, and the television would flip to static in the middle of programs, even when unplugged. Her niece began having episodes of sleepwalking. More than once, Carmen found her standing at the top of the basement stairs, staring down into the dark. One afternoon, while folding laundry, Carmen noticed one of the sheets had a long reddish-brown smear across it. She touched it, sniffed it. It smelled metallic. She immediately checked all the children for cuts. Nothing. She re-washed the sheet, but the stain wouldn't lift. Later that night, she found that same sheet draped neatly over the couch in the basement, though no one had taken it down there. She didn't tell her husband. He'd been trying to hold the family together, focused entirely on Philip's treatments. Every time she brought up the house, he brushed it off, told her she was tired, imagining things, seeing meaning where there was none. But Carmen could feel the walls watching her. She began hearing footsteps at odd hours, bare feet on linoleum. Always slow, always deliberate. Once she waited by the hallway with the lights off and a kitchen knife in hand, determined to confront whoever or whatever it was. The footsteps approached, then stopped, right in front of her. She swung the knife. It met nothing but air. The lights flickered on, and in that instant, for just a second, she saw the reflection in the kitchen window, a man standing behind her in funeral garb, face blurred, hands gloved in blood red. When she turned, the room was empty. Carmen knew she needed help. She contacted the local priest. He was polite but cautious. He agreed to visit the home, though he made it clear that exorcisms were rare and required proof. He walked the rooms with her blessing, each space with holy water. In in the basement, his hand trembled as he anointed the cold room. "This place," he murmured. "It doesn't want to forget." He told her to keep a cross in each bedroom, told her to burn sage, pray nightly. But as he left, he paused at the front door and looked back with tired eyes. "Whatever is here," he said, "you're not imagining it. But be careful. Sometimes when a place has known death, it remembers." The next morning, Carmen awoke to find every cross in the house turned upside down. She didn't scream. She didn't even wake the children. She simply sat at the kitchen table, lit a candle, and prayed silently, lips moving, heart pounding, tears falling. That evening, she gathered the children in the living room and told them they'd be sleeping together downstairs on the fold-out couch. It was warmer there, brighter. And maybe, just maybe, the house would show mercy if they stayed close. But the house didn't want mercy. That night, Carmen woke to a low growl. Not an animal, not a voice. Something in between. It vibrated through the floorboards and into her chest. She held her breath. One of the kids whimpered in their sleep. And then she saw it just beyond the edge of the couch near the base of the stairs. A figure barely visible crouched low to the ground. Its limbs were too long, its posture wrong. It didn't move. It only watched. Carmen blinked. The figure was gone. She held her children tighter, heart pounding, and whispered into the dark, "I see you." And from somewhere deep in the house, something chuckled. Low, amused. As if she had finally passed a test she didn't know she was taking. The morning brought light, but not relief. Everything looked ordinary. Sunlight filtered in through the kitchen blinds. The house smelled of toast and detergent. But Carmen moved like a sleepwalker. Her body performed the motions of breakfast and chores, while her mind turned over the night before, again and again, like a puzzle with no edges. She didn't tell the children what she saw. They were already afraid. Her youngest, Michael, had started talking to someone named Jonah, who lived in the closet and didn't like loud noises. Jonah, he said, used to wear a blue suit and smelled like medicine. She tried to ask gently where he got that name. Michael only blinked and said, "He told me not to say it too loud, or he'll go back in the walls." Carmen's hand trembled as she cleaned the kitchen counters. There were small brown stains on the backsplash stains she swore hadn't been there yesterday. They looked like fingerprints, but upside down, as if someone had hung from the ceiling and reached down. That afternoon, the laundry began folding itself. She had left towels in the dryer, gone upstairs to check on Philip, and returned to find the towels laid out neatly, perfectly creased, arranged in the shape of a cross. She sat down on the floor and pressed her fists into her eyes. The house was playing with her. She knew that now. Not tormenting, yet. Just watching, waiting, revealing itself, piece by piece. She remembered the priest's words, "Doesn't want to forget." But what did it remember? That night, Carmen dreamed of metal tables and white sheets soaked in blood, of a woman crying in the basement, of whispers in Latin. She saw her son's face floating above the gurney, pale, unmoving, with pennies on his eyes. She woke with a gasp, sheets tangled around her legs, throat dry as dust. The house moaned softly as she sat up. No wind outside, no cars on the street. Just that long, deep groan of wood and wall and something else, something alive beneath the skin of the house. The next evening, Carmen brought down an old photo album. The family gathered on the living room floor, flipping through pages of birthdays, holidays, normalcy. For a moment, the tension lifted. They laughed at bad haircuts and silly expressions. Then Philip turned a page and went quiet. It was a photo Carmen didn't recognize, black and white edges curled. It showed a man in a mortician's uniform standing beside a small table in the basement. His eyes stared straight ahead, expression unreadable. "I didn't put that in there," Carmen said quietly. Philip's face paled. "That's him," he whispered. "That's the man I see." Carmen grabbed the photo and marched to the trash can, dropping it in without hesitation. But when she passed by later that night, the photo was back on the counter, dry clean, smiling up at her from the wood. She burned it. The next day, the toaster caught fire without being plugged in. It started with a faint scent, burnt copper, followed by a high-pitched ringing sound. Carmen rushed into the kitchen to find smoke pouring from the toaster flames licking its sides. She yanked it away from the wall, only to realize there was no cord. No power. The toaster hadn't been connected at all. She opened the window and leaned out, gasping, trying to ground herself in the crisp Connecticut air. A neighbor waved from across the street. For a brief moment, normalcy returned, but when she pulled the window closed, she noticed handprints on the inside of the glass, small child-sized smeared, as if someone had tried to crawl up from the sill. The rest of the family began hearing things. Her husband, previously skeptical, admitted that he'd woken one night to find a figure standing at the foot of their bed, staring without breathing. When he switched on the lamp, it was gone, but the shape of 2 bare feet remained imprinted in the carpet for days. The children spoke in whispers about the other kids, the ones who didn't sleep, didn't eat, and didn't blink. Her niece drew pictures of the basement showing pipes dripping with black fluid and shadowy figures in the corners. When asked why she drew them, she only said, "Because they asked me to." That's when Carmen called Ed and Lorraine Warren. The Warrens were well known by then respected, though polarizing. Some called them charlatans, others saviors. Carmen didn't care. She needed someone who wouldn't dismiss her. Someone who had seen things like this and survived. When the Warrens arrived, the house seemed almost pleasant. But Ed tilted his head in the hallway and murmured, "It's hiding. It knows we're here." Lorraine stood in the center of the living room, eyes closed, breathing shallow. She whispered to no one, then opened her eyes and looked straight at Carmen. "You're not crazy," she said gently, "but you are being watched. Constantly." That night they held a seance in the cold room. The children were not allowed to attend. Lorraine sat at the center of a circle of candles. The basement smelled of ash and something older, something that burned the nose. As they began, Carmen felt a pressure around her chest like arms wrapping too tightly. Lorraine's voice grew distant, her face contorted. She began speaking in a voice that wasn't hers, male, raspy, soaked in bitterness. "They're still here," she said. "Still cold, still waiting. They don't want to leave." The candle flames flared violently, and then snuffed out all at once. Darkness swallowed the room, and from the silence came a sound small, childlike. A giggle, echoing, hollow, followed by a whisper that curled into Carmen's ear like smoke. "We remember you." The basement never warmed again after that night. No matter how high they turned the thermostat, no matter how many heaters Carmen dragged down the stairs, the cold clung to the walls like breath from the other side. A wet, bone-deep cold that made her skin crawl and her hands tremble even in summer. She started locking the door to the basement at night. But every morning it would be open again, just a few inches, always the same. Just enough for something to watch. Lorraine's words echoed in her head. They don't want to leave. The Warrens returned with more equipment. Cameras, tape recorders, crucifixes, and prayers. Ed installed holy relics above doorways. Lorraine walked through the home daily, pausing often in corners, whispering quietly, eyes distant. One morning while Carmen prepared breakfast, Lorraine stopped just inside the kitchen and stood perfectly still. Her gaze was fixed on the ceiling above the table. Carmen looked up. There was nothing, just faded white paint and a water stain from a previous winter. But Lorraine's lips parted. "He's here," she whispered. Carmen tried to steady her voice. "Who?" "The undertaker," Lorraine said, still staring upward. "He doesn't like what we're doing." The light above them flickered. The toaster made a loud click, though it hadn't been touched. In the hallway, the thermostat dropped 5 degrees in an instant. Later that afternoon, Ed played back the audio from one of their basement recordings. Static at first, then silence, Then a voice, sharp, guttural, growled low through the speaker mine. That same day, Philip collapsed on the stairs. He had been doing better. The doctors were cautiously hopeful. But something changed. Carmen found him at the foot of the steps, his eyes glassy, body limp. He came to seconds later and began screaming. "They were pulling me down," he cried. "They grabbed my legs. They wanted to." He didn't finish. When they pulled up his pants legs, Carmen then saw bruises around his ankles, fingers shaped too large to be a child's, too distinct to be accidental. That night, Carmen couldn't sleep. Every time her eyes closed, she saw the cold room, not as it was now, but as it must have been, with steel tables, with pale limbs under sheets, with whispers drifting through the embalming tubes like smoke. At 3:11 a.m., she woke to the sound of dragging. She sat upright. It was coming from the hallway outside her bedroom. Slow, steady, deliberate, like someone pulling a wet sack across hardwood. She stood, opened the door slowly, and stepped out into the dark. There was no one there, but the hallway stretched long and cold, and just at the edge of visibility. A figure turned the corner toward the stairs. She followed. Not quickly. She didn't call out. She knew it wouldn't answer. She moved like someone sleepwalking through a nightmare she'd already accepted. The basement door was wide open. Inside, the cold was overwhelming. Her breath misted. She descended the stairs one at a time, each creak echoing like a warning. At the bottom, she stopped. The cold room door had been pried open. Inside stood a man, or what looked like one. He was tall, too tall, dressed in a black suit that shimmered slightly in the dim light. His face was wrong, blurred like water on glass, but his hands, those she could see clearly. Pale, long, tipped with dark nails. In his left hand he held a scalpel, and on the metal table behind him lay a shape under a white sheet. Carmen couldn't move, couldn't scream. Her legs were locked, her throat closed. The man turned slowly and looked at her, or through her. She blinked. He was gone. The room was empty, the table bare, but something scratched at her spine as she turned to leave. That night, Carmen gathered her strength and her journal. She wrote everything. Every flicker of light, every whisper, every bruise, every dream, every scent, every unexplained sound. She documented it all as if the act of naming could lessen its power. Then she picked up the phone and called a local news station. "I don't care if they think I'm crazy," she said. "I need someone to see what's happening here. I need to prove we're not imagining it." The journalist who arrived the next morning was young, skeptical, but polite. He brought a photographer. They stayed for 4 hours, walked the house, asked questions. Then, reviewing one of the photos, the photographer paled. He turned the camera so Carmen could see. In the image of the hallway empty when taken stood a figure halfway up the stairs, tall, blurred, looking directly at the camera. The story made local headlines within days. Family claims former funeral home is haunted. Strangers began driving by the house, slowly. Headlights dimmed. Carmen kept the blinds closed. But still, the house seemed angrier now, as if the exposure had broken some invisible pact. Doors slammed without warning. Clocks stopped at 3:11 every night. The shadows in the corners no longer waited until dark, and in the basement, the drain in the cold room began to leak. Something thick, something dark, that smelled like formaldehyde. Lorraine came one final time. "This place needs more than prayer," she said. "It needs release." She touched Carmen's hand gently. "They remember everything that happened here, and they think it's still happening." Carmen looked around the house, at the walls, at the floor, at the quiet breathing that never quite stopped. And for the first time she whispered back, "Then let's show them it's over." Lorraine's words clung to Carmen like cold mist long after she left. They think it's still happening. That night, Carmen sat alone at the kitchen table, a candle flickering beside her journal. The house was quiet, not calm, not peaceful, just watchful. like it was waiting for her to make the next move. She stared at the grain of the wooden table and thought about the history that lived beneath it. Not just her family's memories, the laughter, the sickness, the fear, but the lives that had passed through this house long before her. The dead that had rested on metal tables, the hands that had prepared them, the sorrow soaked into every floorboard. And now the echoes of those things walked her hallways, watched her children whispered into her dreams. If they remembered everything, then maybe she had to remember too. The next morning, she called in sick to work. She sent the children to stay with a neighbor for the afternoon. Then she descended the basement stairs one more time, this time with a box of old tools, a flashlight, and her courage carefully stitched together. She would face it. The cold room greeted her with its usual chill. The temperature dropped the moment she opened the door, and her breath clouded in front of her like a warning. But she didn't flinch. The metal table sat in the center of the room untouched. She walked around it, hand grazing the cold surface. The drain in the floor was damp again. Not puddled, but enough to darken the surrounding tile. The smell was sharp, chemical, distant. She knelt beside the drain. There was something lodged in the groove, a shard of something white. Carmen tugged gently. It came loose with a wet snap, a fragment of bone, human. She dropped it and scrambled back, heart-pounding bile rising. But she forced herself to breathe. No more fear, no more hiding. She placed the bone fragment into a clean cloth and wrapped it carefully. Then using chalk, she began to draw on the tiles. She wasn't trained in this, not really. But Lorraine had left her a book of prayers, old rites, protective symbols, some from Christian tradition, others older, stranger. She had told Carmen that belief was a bridge, not a weapon. That if the house was repeating the past, then maybe it needed a new story to break the loop. So Carmen told it one. She lit white candles at each corner of the room. She whispered names of her children, of herself, of the living. She told the house that they were not corpses, not patients, not part of whatever unfinished grief still wandered these walls. "We are not yours," she said aloud, voice shaking but clear. Then she took a photo of her family, one from before the move, everyone smiling at a picnic, and placed it at the center of the table. "Look," she said into the dark. "This is who we are. This is what you're not." The air changed. Not warmer, not brighter, but aware, like something had turned its head and was finally listening. She stood still for several minutes. Then slowly, the candles began to flicker one by one and extinguish, not violently, but gently, as if someone had blown them out in a careful line. And when the last one died, the cold faded. Not entirely, not forever, but enough that her skin no longer prickled. That night, no doors opened on their own. No whispers, no shadows pressed against the walls. Just quiet. Carmen fell asleep for the first time in weeks without waking once. But the house was not finished. 3 nights later, she awoke to the sound of humming. It was soft, childlike, a broken melody like someone remembering a song they hadn't sung in years. She followed the sound to the kitchen. There, standing barefoot in the moonlight, was her niece. Eyes open but distant. The humming came from her mouth. Carmen crouched and touched her arm gently. "Sweetheart." The girl turned slowly, blinked once, then looked over Carmen's shoulder. "He says thank you," she whispered, "for remembering." And then she collapsed into Carmen's arms, asleep. The humming stopped. The next morning, the cold room door was sealed shut. Not locked, sealed. The wooden frame had swelled overnight, the hinges stiff, the doorknob stuck. Ed came by to check it, but even with tools, it wouldn't budge. "It's finished," Lorraine said quietly. "At least, for now." Carmen nodded, though something in her still pulsed with unease. The house had shifted. She had felt it. But something remained. Something quieter. Not hostile. Just watching. She didn't burn any more sage. She didn't call another priest. Instead, she began speaking to the house the way one might to an old scar, not as an enemy, but as a wound that no longer needed to bleed. Over the next few weeks, Philip's health improved. His doctors were stunned. His blood work stabilized. His color returned. The house stayed silent. Once, as Carmen folded laundry upstairs, she heard a thud from the hallway. She turned and saw a single white lily resting at her bedroom door. Fresh, dew-covered, she picked it up. No one in the house had brought it. She said nothing. But that night, she placed the lily in a glass jar, set it on the cold room's old table, and whispered, "I haven't forgotten." And in the stillness that followed, something deep in the bones of the house sighed. The seasons turned without announcement, and the house grew quiet. Not hollow, not empty, but still like a patient who had finally exhaled after years of pain. Carmen began to trust the silence again, little by little. But silence in this house was never just silence. There were still moments, unexplained ones. The radio would switch on by itself always to static, always at 3:11 a.m., and then click off after 30 seconds. Doors stayed closed now, but the hinges groaned as if someone stood just beyond shifting their weight. And Carmen had learned not to flinch. Instead, she whispered into the dark, "You're heard." Sometimes that was enough. Philip was healing. He smiled more now, and his dreams were quiet. The night terrors had ceased. But he still wouldn't go into the basement, not even with the door stuck. He said he felt it down there like pressure on his spine. Something vast curled beneath the floorboards. Carmen didn't push him. She didn't return there either. The family started having dinner together again. Laughter returned in small, careful bursts like birds testing the air after a storm. There were no more crosses turned upside down, no more bruises, no more voices in the vents. But the house had one last secret to give. It happened in late autumn, as Carmen was sorting old boxes in the attic. She came across a small, dust-covered trunk with no label, no lock. Inside were papers, yellowed with age death certificates. Notes scribbled in tidy cursive photos, faded into a fog of time. And at the bottom, wrapped in brittle cloth, a journal. It wasn't hers. The cover was cracked. Leather initials burned into the corner, WH. She opened it. The handwriting was precise, almost surgical. The entry spoke of preparation, of ritual. Not spiritual rites, but methodical steps. WH had been the mortician here. His words were void of emotion. Each page described not the dead, but the work, the process. Until the final entry, there is something left behind. It clings. It lingers in the folds of the flesh. I have prayed, but it does not leave. The cold has soaked into me. I fear I may never be warm again. Carmen closed the book slowly. She now knew what they had felt. Residual grief, the memory of unspoken sorrow. Later that night, she lit a candle and placed the journal beside the lily on the table in the cold room. She didn't open the door. She couldn't anymore. But she pressed her hand to the wood and whispered, "I see you. I remember you. You're free." For the first time in months, the house was warm when she woke. It wasn't just the temperature, it was the air. Lighter, sweeter, as if something had passed through and nodded in gratitude on its way out. And yet, even in peace, the house did not forget. Years later, long after they had moved, after Philip had recovered and grown, after the house had been sold to a new family, Carmen still received dreams, not nightmares, memories of the cold room, of children's voices in the walls, of a man in funeral black turning slowly to face her with blurred features and a scalpel in his hand, before bowing his head and stepping back into shadow. She'd wake with her heart calm, her breath even. Not afraid, not anymore, just aware. Some nights, she would light a candle on her nightstand, say a short prayer for the forgotten, and drift to sleep beneath the soft hum of a fan. And in that quiet space between waking and dreaming, she often felt the faintest touch on her hand. A thank you, a goodbye, or perhaps simply a reminder that some places never forget, and some stories don't end. They rest, they sleep, they wait. It wasn't until the new family moved into the house that Carmen understood the full nature of what had been left behind. Not evil. Not exactly. Something older than that. Grief that had grown teeth. Memory that had never been allowed to rest. The call came on a foggy morning in late October, almost 2 years since they'd left. It was the new owner, a woman named Claire, who'd tracked Carmen down through a real estate document and an old news article. Her voice trembled through the phone. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Claire said, "but strange things have been happening." Carmen's stomach turned gently, not in fear, but recognition. Claire continued, "I know this might sound insane, but my daughter keeps talking about a boy in the walls. She says his name is Jonah, that he likes the dark." Carmen closed her eyes. "Jonah again. He's harmless," Carmen said softly. "Lonely. Just don't be afraid of him." There was a silence on the line. Then Claire asked, "Why didn't you destroy it?" "I tried," Carmen said, "but you can't destroy memory. You can only help it settle." She offered advice, not prayers, not rituals, just understanding. Speak to the house. Acknowledge it. Don't let it feed off fear. It doesn't want possession, it wants witness. Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered, "The basement is always cold." Carmen smiled, bittersweet. "Yes, it remembers the dead." And she meant it. Even now, the house still appeared in Carmen's dreams, less frequently now, and always from a distance. She would see it from across the street or in the mirror behind her. The windows were always dark, but never empty. There was a presence still watching, but no longer pressing against the edges of her mind. She kept the old journal, the one marked WH, in a locked drawer. Not because she feared it, but because it felt like part of a story she had been asked to finish. She read from it sometimes, not aloud, but in silence. Each page was a study in precision. Clean death, careful ritual, cold hands doing necessary work. But between the lines, Carmen saw the thread unraveling, a man slowly overcome by what he couldn't explain. The final entries had shifted tone like a confession. "I thought I was helping them pass. I didn't realize they stayed." The silence between deaths grew louder. "There is something here that has always been. I did not create it, but I may have fed it." Carmen sometimes wondered if the house had chosen her, or if it simply found in her a mother who knew how to carry sorrow without dropping it. She had carried her son's illness, her family's fear, and for a time, she carried the house's grief too. The newspapers never followed up. The story faded, as they always do, but the house stayed. And every now and then, Carmen would receive a letter from Claire. Nothing dramatic. Just details. The light flickered in the cold room again. Jonah stood in the corner today, but seemed content. The drain leaked once, but stopped when I sang a lullaby. And at the bottom, always, "Thank you." Carmen never replied. She didn't need to. There was peace now. Not perfection, not erasure, but quiet. And for a house built on death, that was more than anyone could ask. In the final years of her life, Carmen kept a photo of the house tucked into the back of her journal. Not the photo from the newspaper. Not one with shadows or flickers or unexplained figures. Just a simple image. The house under gray skies, front porch sagging slightly. Windows, blank curtains pulled. Still, watching, waiting. She would glance at it now and then before bed, as if to acknowledge a friend she once helped carry through the storm. And then she'd blow out the candle, listen to the fan hum beside her, and drift into sleep, knowing that somewhere behind those walls the past had learned to rest. The years passed slowly, gently. Carmen aged with grace, her hair silvering like frost on old wood, her hands weathered but calm. She lived far from that house now, tucked into a smaller home near the edge of a sleepy New England town where fog rolled in every morning like memory creeping back into the world. Her children had grown. Philip had survived, thrived even. He never spoke of the house, not directly, but sometimes Carmen would catch him pausing in a hallway, looking toward an empty corner a little too long, listening perhaps for something that once whispered only to him. She never asked what he heard. They had both earned their quiet. Carmen kept her days simple gardening reading, taking long walks through the woods. But the night was always different. Nights belonged to memory, that subtle place where time folds and places long left behind can find their way back into your bones. And always in that softened space between dusk and dream came the house. Not violently, not intrusively, just presence. A creak in her new home's hallway that sounded too familiar. A coldness near the baseboards that lingered a second too long. A dream where she stood in the cold room once again, not afraid, not trapped, just standing, watching. It didn't scare her. She knew the difference now between haunting and remembering. One night after waking from a dream, where she'd seen Jonah older finally smiling, Carmen decided to write again. She took out the journal. Not the mortician's, this time hers. The one she had kept in those strange months long ago. Pages faded ink, smudged fear etched in every word. She began a new entry. It has been 18 years since we left, and still the house hums inside me. Not like it used to. Not sharp, not cruel. Just familiar. Like a song with too few notes echoing at the edge of hearing. Sometimes I wonder if the house still remembers me, or if the ones who stayed have all gone now. Passed on. Settled. I hope so. I hope we helped. I hope we gave them the ending they were denied. She closed the journal and placed it beside her bed. And for the first time in years, the dream that came was different. She stood in the cold room, yes, but it was no longer cold. The tiles were clean. The table was gone. The drain was sealed. Light streamed in from a window that had never been there before. And in the center of the room stood a boy, Jonah, not a shadow now, not a whisper in the walls. He looked at her, smiled wide, and said in a voice that sounded like water flowing over stone, "We're not afraid anymore." Carmen reached out, touched his hand, and woke with tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from something else. Closure. That morning she made tea, sat by the window, and watched the fog roll in from the trees. She thought about writing to Claire. It had been years since their last letter, but instead, she pulled a fresh sheet of paper from her drawer and began writing something new. A story, not just about the house, but about what happens after the haunting ends. About what it means to carry grief and then slowly set it down. About the difference between ghosts and memories, and maybe, just maybe, how sometimes they become the same. When she finished the first page, Carmen looked out across her quiet yard, touched by early frost. The wind shifted, and for a moment she thought she heard music, soft, off-key, distant, a broken little lullaby. She smiled. The house was still with her, but it no longer held her, and in the silence that followed, she whispered a final thank you, not to the house, but to everything she had survived inside it. The manuscript grew page by page like ivy across old stone. Carmen wrote each evening by lamplight, the soft scratching of her pen the only sound in the quiet room. She didn't rush. The story wasn't just hers, it belonged to the house, to the ones who lingered in its dark corners and whispered through vents to the pain that had once pressed its cold palm over her chest. She didn't seek publication. It wasn't that kind of writing. It was more like translation, turning memory into language, grief into form, giving shape to things that had once only existed in the space between sleep and scream. By the 5th chapter, she noticed something. The house in her dreams had begun to change. Where once the cold room loomed, wet, dark, windowless, now stood a space filled with light. There was warmth in the tiles, a table with a vase of lilies, the smell of soap, of lemon, of wood polish, and fresh air. Someone was taking care of it. Carmen began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the house had learned to take care of itself. One evening, after writing late into the night, she woke from a dream so vivid it left her breathless. She'd been standing on the basement stairs, looking down not into darkness, but into a garden. Sunlight poured through broken floorboards overhead. The embalming table had been replaced with soft earth, and vines crawled the walls, sprouting pale flowers. A wind blew gently, carrying children's laughter like wind chimes, and standing in the center with his back to her was the mortician, still in his black coat but no longer blurred, still, quiet, at peace. He turned not sharply, not with menace but slowly, as though hearing his name for the first time in a long while. He looked at her and bowed. When Carmen woke, her pillow was damp with tears, not from sorrow, from release. The next morning, she received an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed the house on Meriden Avenue bright with morning light. The front porch repainted, the windows clean. Children's toys were scattered across the lawn. Wind chimes hung from the awning, and flower boxes lined the railings. On the back of the photo, written in delicate looping script, was a single line. "Thank you for leaving it better than you found it." No name, no signature, but she didn't need one. Carmen held the photograph to her chest, breathing in slow, steady rhythm. She had never expected gratitude. She had expected survival, maybe healing. But this silent, simple acknowledgement felt like the final page in a book long overdue. That night, she placed the photo inside her journal. Then, with steady hands, she gathered the manuscript she had been working on, wrapped it in soft linen, tied it with string, and tucked it gently into a cedar box near her bed. She didn't know who would read it, but she believed someone would, and when they did, they'd understand that not every haunting ends with an exorcism. Sometimes it ends with remembrance, and that's enough. She turned out. The light listened to the soft hum of the fan and whispered into the dark, "Good night." And somewhere far away, or perhaps just under the skin of the world, a house listened, and for the first time in a very long time, did not answer back. Winter arrived quietly. Snow came early that year, blanketing Carmen's world in silence and softness. The air grew sharp, and the windows stayed closed. Her garden slept beneath frost-laced soil, and the trees outside her window stood like sentinels carved in ice. She adjusted to the hush, the slowness of the season, but she noticed something strange. The dreams stopped completely. No more visits to the cold room. No more glimpses of Jonah or the mortician or the house glowing in the distance. The lullaby was gone. The static gone. Even the subtle breath she used to feel on her skin in the hour between sleep and waking gone. She wasn't sure if she should be relieved or mournful. The absence felt clean but also hollow. One evening, after brushing the snow from her porch steps, she sat by the fireplace with a cup of tea and pulled the journal from the drawer again. She flipped to the final entry, read her own handwriting. "We're not haunted anymore. We're remembering. And then we're letting go." She wondered if there was such a thing as a second haunting, not of fear or spirits, but of memory that was too quiet. When something that had once pressed close suddenly disappeared, it left an outline, a negative space, a phantom not of pain, but of peace. She didn't write that night. She just sat with it. The stillness, the absence, the warmth of the fire crackling like old bones finally resting. The phone rang the next morning. It was Claire's daughter. Now 17, her voice was low, hesitant, thoughtful. "Hi, I know we've never met, but my mom used to tell me about you." Carmen smiled into the receiver. "And what did she say?" "She said the house stopped hurting after you left." A pause. "Then I just wanted to say thank you." Carmen closed her eyes. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Another pause. "Do you think it's really gone, all of it?" Carmen's voice was soft but sure. "No, not gone. Just asleep. The way memory sleeps. Deep and still until it's needed again." The girl exhaled. "That makes sense." And then more quietly she said, "Sometimes I dream about the basement. But it's not scary. It's just quiet. Like someone closed the door but didn't lock it." Carmen smiled. "That's exactly what it is." That night the dreams returned. Not as visions, not as shadows, not as hauntings, just impressions. a hallway where the lights never flickered, a boy named Jonah laughing as he ran through sunlit rooms, a man in black wiping down a clean metal table with reverence, not dread, and then nothing, just darkness, but not the kind that presses in, the kind that wraps gently like a quilt pulled up to your chin. When Carmen awoke, she felt rested in a way she hadn't for decades. Something was complete. Some chapter, some long, strange chapter had finally quietly turned. She rose from bed, poured herself a cup of coffee, and watched the snow fall in soft spirals outside her window. No whispers, no echoes, just peace. But before she turned away, she thought just for a second that she saw something in the glass, a shape reflected over her shoulder, tall, familiar, but not threatening, a presence that nodded and then vanished. She placed her hand on the window pane, let the cold press into her palm, and whispered one last time, "I remember." The house didn't answer. It didn't need to anymore. Spring arrived in hesitant waves, melting the snow drip by drip, like memory softening in the warmth of time. Carmen opened her windows again. The air smelled like earth, like thaw, like a beginning disguised as an end. She spent more time outside. Walks lengthened. Nights felt easier. Sleep came without the heaviness that once followed her like a shadow. And for the first time since she left that house, Carmen no longer waited for something to stir. She had grown used to being haunted not by spirits, but by the expectation of them. For years, she'd lived braced heart, slightly tightened, waiting for a knock at the edge of her awareness. But now, nothing knocked, and yet she was not alone. One evening, as the sky shifted through its soft blues and golds, Carmen sat on the back porch with a blanket and her journal. She turned through the pages. She had written the story of the house, the story of herself. It wasn't just about fear. It had never been. It was about survival, about bearing witness, about how even the dead sometimes need someone to say, "I saw you. I heard you. I did not turn away." She thought about publishing the manuscript, but no, it wasn't meant for shelves. It was meant for the quiet, for people who needed it, for someone someday who might find themselves staring at a hallway filled with whispers and wonder if they were losing their mind. She wrote one final inscription on the inside cover. "If you found this, you're not alone, and neither are they." Some memories are loud. Some just want to rest beside you a while. Let them. And then when they're ready, let them go. She placed the manuscript in a sealed envelope and tucked it into a cedar chest lined with other keepsakes, a folded cloth stained with candle wax, the photo of the house, the white lily long pressed flat between two glass panes. Carmen smiled to herself, not with pride, not with satisfaction, but with peace. She made herself a cup of chamomile tea, dimmed the lights, and turned on her fan, a habit that had stayed with her all these years. The soft hum filled the room, familiar and grounding. That night she dreamt not of the house, but of a long corridor bathed in golden light. At the far end, a door stood open, not cold, not ominous, just open. Beyond it, voices, not whispers, not screams, laughter, and one low voice familiar as her own saying softly, "It's done." When Carmen woke, the candle by her bedside had burned all the way down. Its wick floated in a pool of wax, flickering its last. She didn't replace it. She just watched the flame go out, and for the first time in decades, she didn't feel the need to light another. Days folded into one another, like soft pages in a well-worn book. Carmen moved gently through them, watering plants, mailing letters, baking small loaves of bread she rarely finished, but enjoyed making nonetheless. She spoke to neighbors when they passed, smiled at the mailman, and once in a while stopped by the library to read in silence. The manuscript stayed in its cedar chest untouched, but never forgotten. And the dreams, they didn't return. Not because something was wrong, because something had ended. One afternoon, as golden light stretched long across her wooden floors, Carmen received a package she hadn't expected. It was small, wrapped in brown paper, no return address. Just her name written in simple script. Inside there was no letter, only a book. The cover was blank, But when she opened it, her breath caught. It was her manuscript, her handwriting, but not her journal. Typed, formatted, printed on thick ivory pages. On the title page, "The House That Remembers" by C.R. Snedeker. Her initials. No one else could have prepared this, and yet someone had. Tucked inside the last page was a small photograph, sepia-toned, slightly curled. It was of the house, not in shadow, not surrounded by fog, but in daylight, freshly painted, wind chimes dancing from the porch rail. The upstairs window opened just enough to let a curtain breathe. On the back of the photo in a child's handwriting were 4 words. He smiles now, "Thank you." That night, Carmen lit a single candle, not for fear, not for ritual, just as a signal, a soft glow to say, "I see you. I still remember. I always will." She placed the book beside her bed, ran her hand gently over its cover, and lay down with a slow, deep breath. The fan hummed. The world outside turned to dusk, and for the first time in her life, Carmen did not fall asleep despite the silence. She fell asleep because of it. In the space where dreams used to live, there was only warmth, and in the distance, though, not in her mind, not in a dream, not even in memory, an old house stood in stillness, not haunted, not cursed, just waiting for morning. The following days brought a lightness Carmen hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't the absence of weight, but the presence of stillness, a kind of hush that filled the rooms without asking for attention. The candle beside her bed burned lower each night. She didn't replace it. Not because she forgot, but because it didn't feel necessary anymore. The light wasn't a shield now. It was a memory, a quiet companion she no longer needed to protect herself from the dark. One morning, Carmen found herself at the edge of the woods near her home, walking the trails she'd wandered so many times before. But today she paused. There was an old bench beneath a crooked tree, one she usually passed without thought. But now, it felt like a place she was meant to sit. She did. The wind was gentle, brushing her hair back like a mother might soothe a child. She pulled the photo from her coat pocket, the one from the manuscript, the house, the curtain dancing in the open window, the note in a child's hand. He smiles now. "Thank you." She held it between her palms. "I used to think you wanted to hurt us," she whispered. "But you were just trying to be seen." The trees didn't answer, but their silence wasn't empty. After a while, she folded the photo back into her coat and sat with the stillness a little longer. It wasn't just about the house anymore. Carmen realized that. It had never only been the house. It was about all the places in the world where grief had gone unnoticed, where loss had soaked into the walls and memory had soured into something desperate. She had lived through one such place, and she had survived it, not by escaping, but by staying long enough to understand what it was asking for. Witness, nothing more, nothing less. That evening, she returned home and placed a new sheet of paper into her typewriter, an old machine she rarely used, but had kept all these years. She began to type. There are places in this world that do not forget. Rooms that breathe. Floors that groan. Corners that never lose their chill. But memory is not a curse. Not always. Sometimes it just needs a hand to hold before it lets go. She paused, her fingers resting on the keys. A breeze touched her shoulder through the open window. It smelled like pine and something older. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Whatever lingered behind her now did so in peace. Not in shadow, just presence. And presence, Carmen had learned, wasn't the same as haunting. Sometimes it was love that had nowhere else to go. She smiled, typed the final line of the page. And when love is seen even in the darkest corners, it softens. And then it sleeps. She pulled the page free, placed it on the stack growing beside her, and leaned back into the hush of her little room. Outside, night settled in soft and low. Inside, not a single shadow moved. And in her chest, for the first time in a long, long while, nothing stirred. The next morning, Carmen rose before the sun, not because of a sound or a dream or the uneasy press of something unseen, simply because her body felt ready, as if she'd slept the precise number of hours needed to wake fully whole. She moved through the house with the grace of routine, making tea, folding the blanket on the couch, cracking the window just enough to let the chill in. The quiet felt clean, not sterile, not void, just complete. She sat at the small desk near the window, where her manuscript now rested in a neat stack, weighted by a stone paperweight, shaped like an open hand. A gift from a friend long ago. She didn't open the manuscript. She didn't need to. Instead, she pulled out a new notebook, one with untouched pages and a cover the color of bone, and began to write again. But this time it wasn't about the house. It was about after, the long shadows of healing. The quiet after grief has unpacked its last suitcase and decided to stay not as a burden, but as a guest. She wrote about windows that used to creak and no longer did. About children who used to sleepwalk, but now slept deeply. About the subtle way a place can shift, not because something leaves, but because someone stays long enough to listen. By noon, she had finished the first chapter. She stepped outside with her tea and sat on the porch, the sun warming her legs. Across the street, children played in a yard, their laughter echoing in high, happy bursts. A white butterfly landed on the railing beside her. Its wings opened and closed slowly like breath. Carmen watched it for a long time, and then she did something she hadn't done in years. Something that felt foreign and fragile, yet entirely right. She laughed, not loudly, not to herself, just softly. A sound without defense, a sound without sorrow. It came from a place that had been silent far too long. She stood and went back inside. But before closing the door, she turned and looked out across the sky, blue and endless and unburdened. And she whispered, "You can rest now. I'm not afraid to live without you." There was no reply, just the sound of the wind slipping past the porch posts. But even in its silence, Carmen knew it heard her. Time passed without milestones. There were no more strange packages, no whispered names in the night, no echoes in hallways that stretched too long. Days came and went like soft tides, and Carmen found herself living more in the present than she ever had before. But every so often, on certain mornings when the sun rose just right through the bedroom window and painted long rectangles of light on her floor, she would feel it. Not fear, not the house, just the memory of being watched, and the gentler memory of not minding it. She had changed. The haunting hadn't simply left her, it had been woven into her. It was a stitch in the fabric of her being now. Not a tear, not a wound, a seam. One evening, she was invited to speak at a local library for a small group of readers who had somehow quietly found her manuscript. She never asked how it had gotten out. Maybe Claire had shared it. Maybe someone found a copy she left behind in a waiting room tucked between the pages of an old magazine. Carmen wasn't interested in the logistics. She only said yes. The room was small, filled with creaky chairs and warm lamplight. A dozen faces looked up at her, curious, quiet kind. She began by reading from the very first page. Her voice shook slightly at first, not from fear, but memory. But as she read, the words became stronger. Not because they were perfectly written, but because they were true. And truth, she had learned, was the most powerful kind of peace. When she finished, the room was silent. But not awkwardly so. It was the kind of silence that felt full, like breath held in reverence. Someone raised a hand. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Carmen thought for a moment, then smiled. "I believe in pain that hasn't been heard. I believe in love that doesn't know how to let go. I believe some places remember what people forget." A man in the back wiped at his eye. Another voice, softer, asked, "Do they ever really leave?" Carmen tilted her head. "Sometimes, but more often they change. They settle. They find new ways to exist." Afterward, people came up to her one by one, not to question, but to thank her. For the story, for the stillness, for giving shape to something they had always felt but could never name. She left the library with a soft ache in her chest. Not sadness, gratitude, because now she understood the haunting had never been about terror. It had been about connection. and connection once made honestly never truly vanishes. Back home, she poured a cup of tea, stepped onto her porch, and looked up at the stars. She whispered nothing this time. The silence didn't need to be filled. And in that quiet, something within her settled deeper. The story was no longer waiting to be written. It had already found its ending, and she finally had found her beginning. The moon was full that night, casting silver light across Carmen's yard in soft lines that glowed against the budding grass. From her porch, the world looked untouched, perfect even. She held her cup of tea close, letting the steam warm her face. Inside the house, everything was quiet, not heavy, not waiting, just at rest. Carmen sat for a while, watching the wind ripple gently through the trees, the way it had all those years ago on the last night in the house on Meriden Avenue. But here the wind didn't bring whispers. It didn't pull at the curtains or tap on the windows like fingers from the other side. It simply passed, and for once so did Carmen's thoughts. She didn't drift into memory. She didn't scan for shadows. She didn't listen for sounds that weren't there. She just breathed. The fan hummed softly in her bedroom. Its familiar rhythm followed her through the house like a quiet old friend. The scent of chamomile lingered in the air. She moved slowly, not because of age or ache, but because there was no need to hurry anymore. No one was chasing her now. She passed her cedar chest and ran her hand gently across its lid. Inside rested the manuscript, the photograph, the lily long since dried and yellowed into fragility, the cloth-wrapped shard of bone she had never thrown away, not because she needed to hold on to it, but because it had never felt like hers to bury. It was a piece of someone else's unfinished sentence. She kept it like a bookmark, a reminder of a story once told in silence. As she reached her bedroom, she paused at the doorway and glanced back. Just for a moment, she half expected something to be there. The tall, thin man in the dark suit. Jonah peeking from behind the hall corner. The shifting veil between now and then parting just enough to say, "We're still here." But nothing stirred. Not a single movement. Only the soft flicker of her bedside candle and the hum of her fan. She smiled. Sleep came easy that night, and in the liminal place between waking and dream, Carmen once again found herself in a house, but not the old one. This house was entirely unfamiliar. New. Clean. Whitewashed walls. Windows open wide to an endless spring sky. Light poured in from every direction, warm and full. There were no doors, only long hallways that led gently nowhere. And laughter. Not haunting, not broken, just laughter. She moved through the space, barefoot and unafraid. With each step, memories drifted from the floor like dust in golden light. Images of her children, of the cold room of the house on Meriden Avenue, of fear and of healing. In the center of a wide room, she found a wooden chair and a typewriter, her old one. A single page sat in the tray. She leaned down and read it. "There is nothing left to be done. You did not end it. You witnessed it. And that was enough. Some hauntings don't want to be solved. They want to be seen. And you at last looked back." She touched the keys, typed 3 words without thinking. "I am home." When she woke the next morning, the sun was already spilling across her bed, and the candle had gone out sometime in the night, its wick barely smoldering its job complete. The air smelled like sunlight. Carmen rose slowly, stretching each limb with the gentle awareness that her body was still hers, still strong, still moving. The warmth in the room was soft, not from the heater, but from something more natural. The way morning light filtered through the curtains and soaked into the walls like honey. She didn't light the candle that morning. Instead, she opened all the windows, let the breeze in, let the house breathe. The journal lay closed on her nightstand. She touched it briefly as she passed, no longer out of need, but out of affection. Like greeting an old friend whose visit had finally come to an end. Downstairs, she brewed her tea with slow, practiced hands. The kettle hissed gently, and she smiled at the sound. Outside, birds chattered. Somewhere down the street, A dog barked once and fell silent again. The world continued, and she let it. No signs, no omens, no cold spots on the floor, no flickering lights. It had been weeks since the last dream. Weeks since she'd even remembered to look for one. She no longer checked the corners of rooms. She no longer slept with one foot uncovered just to tempt the shadows. She no longer whispered into the dark, because now the dark whispered nothing back. After breakfast, she took a walk through her yard. The grass had begun to thicken with the new season patches of green, pushing up through the last brittle remnants of winter. At the far end, where the hedge bent around a weathered fence post, Carmen saw something curious. A white stone. She knelt beside it. It wasn't a headstone, not really. Just a small, smooth piece of granite worn at the edges as if handled many times. No name, no date. Just a carving, shallow and elegant. Here lies the weight. She didn't remember placing it there, but it didn't surprise her. Carmen touched the top of the stone and felt a warmth radiating up through her palm, not heat, but recognition. The weight was gone, and someone had helped her put it down. She stood, took a breath, and walked back toward the house. That night, she stood at her window one last time and looked out into the darkness. There were no shapes, no reflections, no tall figures in the glass, just her, just the night. And in that pure, quiet stillness, she smiled and said, not aloud, not in her mind, but in her bones, "You were never here to haunt me. You were waiting to be heard." And somewhere far from Southington, far from the house that once held her tightly in its silent grip, far from the cold room and the candle-lit prayers, a door closed gently, not with force, not with fear, just finality. Spring became summer without ceremony. The days lengthened, stretching into soft blue evenings, filled with bird song and the occasional thunder in the distance. Carmen's home, once a place of silence and watchfulness, now pulsed with a subtle kind of joy. Nothing grand, just alive. She found herself humming again, small, absent-minded melodies, bits of lullabies she once sang to her children, fragments of tunes she'd long forgotten, the kind of music that fills the space where fear used to live. The manuscript stayed tucked away. She didn't need to revisit it, but others did. Letters began to arrive. Slow at first, one every few weeks, then more frequently. Typed, handwritten, sometimes barely legible. Many came with no return address. Each carried a story, from people who had lived in houses where footsteps echoed behind them at night, where laughter had no source, where cold air hung in bedrooms long after the windows were closed. They all said the same thing in different words. "Your story made mine feel less lonely." Carmen read each one. She didn't reply, there was no need. The words had already answered something in them. What mattered wasn't advice. It was acknowledgement that they weren't broken, that they weren't crazy, that maybe, just maybe, what they'd seen or felt or heard wasn't something to escape, but something asking to be remembered. One envelope held nothing but a drawing, crayon on paper, scribbled in a child's hand. A house, windows all dark except for one glowing yellow, and a stick figure woman standing at the door with a candle in her hand. No name, no message, just the image. Carmen tacked it to her refrigerator beside her grocery list and smiled every time she passed it, because she knew what it meant. The house still whispered to others, not to harm, to reach, and now her story whispered back. One evening, she sat on her porch, arms folded gently in her lap, watching the sky darken into that in-between color, neither blue nor black. A quiet hour, an honest one. She thought briefly of returning to the house on Meriden Avenue, just once, just to stand in front of it, to see it without weight, without ghosts, without the gravity of her past dragging at her heels. But she didn't go. She didn't need to. That house lived in her still, but not like before. Not as something unfinished, not as something that pulsed with cold. Now it lived like an old story, read aloud, closed gently, placed on a shelf, and remembered with love. By mid-July, Carmen had stopped counting the years. She no longer marked anniversaries, not of the house, not of the hauntings, not of the night she'd stood in the basement and told the dead they were not forgotten. What had once felt like anchors in time now drifted like leaves in a stream present, but no longer pulling her down. Some stories were written in blood. Hers had been written in silence. Now it simply lived on paper in memory, in the echoes passed between strangers who had never met, but somehow knew the same cold. She received a phone call one afternoon from a local museum curator. He had read part of her manuscript, someone had shared a copy, and he wanted to feature a section of it in an exhibit titled Haunted America, The Spaces That Remember. He spoke gently, respectfully, as if afraid to awaken something. Carmen listened quietly, sipping her tea. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then she said yes, but only one page, and only the right one. They settled on the final paragraph of chapter 14, a section she had written without fanfare, but which had lingered in readers' minds like a bell in deep fog. I was never alone in that house, not really. I think that's what scared me the most at first. But now, I wonder if that was its gift. To teach me that even the quietest cries deserve a listener, and that some echoes aren't curses, they're invitations. The page was framed in glass. Visitors passed by it every day, most without stopping. But some did. And for those who did, something settled behind their eyes, recognition perhaps. Not of the house, but of that soft hidden ache, the kind that doesn't come from fear, but from not being heard. Carmen never visited the museum. She didn't need the validation. The house had taught her that some things are meant to be shared, yes, but not clung to. That night, she walked barefoot through her home windows, open to the summer breeze. The fan hummed in the corner, steady as ever, and on a whim she turned off all the lights. Let the dark return. Let it wrap her like it once had, only now she welcomed it. It didn't whisper. It didn't move. It simply was. And in that quiet, Carmen said nothing. She didn't pray. She didn't plead. She didn't protect. She just stood, and the dark stood with her. Two old companions, finally at peace. August brought with it long, humming evenings, the kind where the sky holds the last of the sun, just a little longer, as though reluctant to let it go. Carmen had grown to love those in-between hours, the slow stretch of shadow, the soft gold that slipped over her porch railings, and the sound of cicadas rising like a tide in the trees. There were no more letters now, no more packages. The world had gone quiet around her, not empty, but still, as if after all this time even the unseen had settled into its corner of the universe, content to simply be. One day, while cleaning out a drawer she hadn't opened in years, Carmen found an old cassette recorder, dusty, heavier than she remembered. It had once belonged to the Warrens, left behind by accident maybe, or perhaps not. She remembered using it once during the worst stretch when the voices in the vents had started to speak in languages they did not know when Philip wouldn't sleep, and when the cold room door had begun unlocking on its own. She sat with it now on her kitchen table, unsure why she'd held on to it. The tape inside was unlabeled, probably blank, but something in her fingers moved without asking. She pressed play. For several seconds there was only static, soft, low like rainfall behind thick glass. Then a sound emerged, not a voice, not words, breath, long, slow, measured, then barely perceptible two soft knocks. Carmen leaned in, and then a laugh, light, distant, not mocking, not malevolent, a child's laugh. Jonah, her throat caught for a moment, not in fear, but in something else. A pang of recognition, a ghost of comfort. She let it play, even as the tape hissed and cracked with age. And finally a voice, not hers, not Philip's, not anyone she recognized, yet deeply familiar. She saw us. The tape clicked, ended. She didn't rewind it, didn't play it again. She just sat there, sunlight pooling across her table, hands folded over the machine like a prayer. They had known all along, all of them, that she wasn't running, that she had stayed, witnessed, held space for what had once been unbearable. Not to fix, but to see. Later that evening, Carmen walked the boundary of her property, barefoot in the grass, the warmth of the earth curling up into her soles. At the far edge beneath the elm tree, she paused. There was a breeze, not cold, not sharp, just enough. She tilted her face upward and let it wash over her, and from somewhere in the movement of leaves, she thought she heard it again. That laugh, then nothing. But in that, nothing, Carmen smiled, because she finally understood. Some stories don't haunt to terrify. They haunt to be remembered, and once they are, they let go. As September edged into the trees, Carmen noticed the light changing. It wasn't the angle exactly. It was the tone, a softer gold, a fading warmth. The kind of light that doesn't demand your attention, but glows just long enough to say goodbye. She found herself walking more. In the mornings, she wandered through dew-covered grass. In the evenings, she watched the sun fold itself into the horizon. With each step, with each breath, Carmen felt herself stretching further away from the woman she once was, the one who held her breath in the dark, who whispered to shadows, who waited for the floorboards to speak. Now the quiet wasn't suspense, it was freedom. One morning, as she passed the stone marker at the edge of the yard, the one she never moved, never disturbed, she noticed something small resting against it. A single dried sprig of rosemary. She picked it up gently, crushed it between her fingers. The scent released instantly, sharp, clean, familiar. Remembrance. She didn't need to wonder who left it, or when. The house had never been about proof. It had always been about presence. Later that evening, Carmen opened the cedar chest once more. She hadn't touched it in weeks. Inside, everything was just as she'd left it. The manuscript, the photo, the dried lily, the fragment of bone. She ran her fingers along the edges of each item, small pieces of a much larger story. Then carefully she lifted out the manuscript. She held it in her lap, heavy with the silence of years. She didn't read it. She just felt its weight. And then after a long, steady breath, she picked up a pen and wrote one final line on the last page. I didn't survive the haunting. I became the one who stayed. And sometimes that's the most terrifying thing of all. To remain long enough to become the witness. To carry the echoes until they fade. She closed the manuscript and wrapped it again, this time in fresh linen. This was no longer a wound. It was an offering. That night, she placed it gently on the front step of the local library, tucked beneath a small rock to keep the wind from stealing it. No name, no explanation, just a story left like a seed. She didn't look back as she walked home, didn't wonder who might find it, didn't try to control where it might go. The story had never really been hers to keep. It had only passed through her. That was enough. And in the silence that followed, the silence that once meant terror, then meant memory, and now simply meant peace, Carmen slipped into sleep without dreaming, because the house was finally quiet, and so was she. The first frost arrived overnight. Carmen woke to a thin veil of white across her windows, delicate and lacy like breath held too long. Outside, the grass glimmered with ice, and the tips of the trees shimmered like glass. She stood at her window for a while, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, not watching for anything, just watching. There had been a time when she feared mornings like this, when the cold reminded her too much of the basement of the cold room of breath, misting in the dark, while shadows paced just beyond the edge of light. But now the cold was just that, cold, no presence behind it, no voice beneath it, just weather. She opened the window slightly, letting the sharp air rush in and sting her cheeks. It didn't hurt. It woke her up. Later, she bundled herself in a scarf and stepped outside. The stone marker beneath the elm was half buried under leaves. Now its carved words faded even further by time. She brushed it clean with her sleeve. Still there. Here lies the weight. She knelt and placed a small wooden box beside it. Inside was the dried lily, the rosemary sprig, and a note that simply said, "You don't have to wait anymore." She didn't stay for a sign, didn't expect one. The act itself was the message. In the afternoon, she took out a clean notebook, something she hadn't touched in months, and began writing again. But this time, not about the house, not about haunting, not about echoes, cold rooms, or things left behind. She wrote about resilience, about how some people survive by running, but others survive by standing still, about how witnessing something unexplainable doesn't make you broken, it makes you chosen. She wrote for those who never spoke of what they felt, who dismissed the chill on their neck, the pull in their chest, the voice they almost heard whispering their name. She wrote not to explain the paranormal, but to remind others that you don't have to understand something to honor it. That evening, as she folded her laundry and placed it into neat stacks, she noticed something strange. A small pale feather on her windowsill. Not blown in by wind, there was no breeze. Just resting there, perfectly placed. She picked it up, turned it between her fingers. Soft, weightless, unthreatening. She didn't smile. She just nodded. The feather wasn't a message. It was a punctuation mark. A quiet period at the end of a very long sentence. And Carmen, after all this time, was ready to begin a new paragraph. The next morning arrived with rain. Steady quiet and cleansing. It wasn't the kind of storm that battered windows or stirred up the past. It was a soft rain, a rain that knew when to whisper instead of roar. Carmen opened the curtains wide and let the gray light wash into every corner of the house. No shadows chased it, no cold slithered in behind it. The rain simply fell. She spent the morning barefoot, walking slowly from room to room, placing her palms against the walls, not searching, not remembering, just acknowledging. This was her home now, a home that held no echoes, a home that answered only to the present. In the kitchen, she paused by the sink and stared out through the window. The world beyond the glass was blurred by water. The trees, the fields, the faraway road, all softened, all distant. She let herself remember. Not the horror, not the fear, just the stillness after. The long nights spent sitting with silence until it became familiar. The voices that had once scared her, how they had softened when she listened. The weight she had carried and eventually placed down. Outside, a single crow landed on the railing of her porch, black against the silver of the sky. It didn't caw. It didn't move. It simply watched her for a long moment. Then it flew off, disappearing into the rain. She took that as a sign, not of warning, not of haunting, but of closure. An old chapter carried off by wings she no longer had to follow. That afternoon, she returned to the notebook and continued writing. But the tone had shifted. The pages now spoke of quiet rituals, the comfort of folding a warm towel, the pleasure of morning light on bare skin, the gift of deep, dreamless sleep. And she wrote a new line one that surprised even her as she formed it. I thought the story ended when the house went silent, but that wasn't the end. That was the beginning of listening to myself. She paused after that, laid the pen down, and stared out the window as the rain slowed, then stopped altogether. Outside, the light shifted again. The first orange leaf of autumn dropped from a branch and landed gently on the porch. She didn't go out to collect it. She let it rest where it fell, because some things no longer needed to be held. They just needed to be witnessed as they were, and that was enough. Autumn rolled in without drama, without a chill that bit too deep. Just a slow fade of green into amber, of heat, into hush. Carmen's yard became a canvas of quiet transformation. Leaves whispered down in spirals. The earth turned softer beneath her feet. Even the birdsong changed, less frantic, more measured, like lullabies for a world getting ready to sleep. She found herself slowing too, not from age, from ease. For the first time, in what felt like lifetimes, she had no story pressing behind her ribs, no pulse of unfinished memory in her walls. She rose when she wanted, wrote, when she felt called, and sometimes spent entire afternoons in silence, not because she needed to avoid sound, but because the silence was finally hers. One such afternoon, she wandered out behind the old elm. The grass there had grown tall again, wild and golden. The stone marker remained softened by seasons nearly overtaken by moss, but still legible. Here lies the weight. She sat beside it, knees bent to her chest, and rested her hand on the earth. She didn't expect anything. No message, no cold wind, no laugh from a forgotten child. Just a heartbeat, her own, steady, present. She remembered the girl she used to be, the woman who had stood between her family and a house that remembered too much, who had held her breath in the dark, who had whispered back when others would have run. She no longer pitied that version of herself. She honored her. Carmen reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something small, a smooth, flat stone. On it, she had written 2 words, "You're safe." She placed it beside the old marker, not to replace it, to continue it. Then she whispered into the leaves around her, "I'm safe too." The trees said nothing, but the wind stirred the grass like a sigh of recognition. That evening, she lit no candles, no incense, no prayers. She simply opened every window in the house and let the scent of the changing season pour in. And as she lay down that night, fan humming low in the corner, she realized something unexpected. She didn't need to tell the story anymore. It had told itself, and now it was listening back. The wind grew cooler with each passing day, curling through the windows like a reminder. Not of fear, not of ghosts, but of change. Carmen began preparing the house for winter. She didn't do it hurriedly. No part of her moved with urgency anymore. She folded blankets with care-dusted shelves that hadn't seen attention in months, brought her herbs inside from the garden before the frost took them. It was a rhythm she knew by heart, one learned long before the haunting, and one that had somehow survived it. One afternoon, while sweeping leaves from her porch, she spotted a small envelope tucked behind the flower box. Pale blue, no stamp, no writing on the front. She knew immediately this was not a letter meant to be mailed. She opened it slowly, hand steady, breath calm. Inside was a photograph, a hallway, long, dimly lit. Walls aged but clean. At the end stood a door she hadn't seen in years. The cold room. She blinked. Her pulse didn't quicken. Her stomach didn't twist. Instead, she studied the image. The door was closed. Taped to the bottom of the photo was a note in a child's handwriting. 4 words. "We're warm now. Goodbye." She didn't cry. She just held the photo in her hand for a long while, then folded it gently and placed it in the pocket of her coat. That night, she made tea, wrapped herself in a wool shawl, and sat by the fire. No book, no music, just the soft sound of the logs crackling and the occasional gust of wind brushing against the windows. When the fire dimmed, she walked to her writing desk, opened her notebook, and added a new paragraph to a story she hadn't touched in weeks. They were never waiting for me to fix them. They were waiting for someone to stay long enough to see the story all the way through. To say, "Yes, I feel you. You're not lost." And now, they're no longer searching for the ending. She signed it Carmen Ruth Snedeker, not because she needed credit, but because it felt right to leave her name on something that once tried to erase it. She turned off the lights and went to bed. No candles, no fears, just the open window. And the night. Quiet, full, and finally whole. First snow arrived quietly, not a blizzard, not a storm. Just a gentle layering flakes, drifting like ash from some far-off sky, softening the world beneath a blanket of white. The town grew hushed. Roads thinned, branches bowed with the weight of stillness. Carmen stood at her front window, wrapped in an old knit cardigan, hands curled around a mug. She watched the flakes fall, each one disappearing on the pane before it could stay long enough to be known. And yet, they landed, one after another, until even the loudest memories were muted. She stepped outside without shoes. The snow pressed cold against her feet, but not cruel. Just real, just present. At the base of the elm, the stone marker peeked from beneath a dusting of white. The second stone, the one she had added, "You're safe," sat beside it, barely touched. She didn't brush them clean this time. She let them rest. That day she received another letter, though this one was expected. It came from a woman in Oregon, a stranger. someone who had read her story through the museum's exhibit. The letter wasn't long. No haunting tales. No desperate pleas for help. Just something simple. A thank you and a question. Did you ever stop being afraid of the dark? Carmen reread the line several times. She thought about the basement, the voices, the chill that had once lived in her spine. She thought about Jonah, about the scalpel gleaming in a man's gloved hand, about the figure at the end of the hallway always waiting, always watching. And then she thought about the night she left the manuscript on the library steps, about the silence that followed, about the candle she'd stopped lighting. She sat at her desk and replied on thick cream-colored paper. I didn't stop being afraid of the dark. I just stopped thinking fear meant I wasn't safe. The dark still visits, but now I let it sit beside me. It has nothing left to say. She folded the letter, sealed it, and mailed it the next day. That evening, the wind howled once through the trees, only once. Then the world was still again. As she moved through her house, Carmen passed the mirror in her hallway. For years, she had avoided looking too long, always fearing what might appear just over her shoulder. But tonight she paused. She stared at her own reflection, not searching behind it, just looking at herself. Her eyes, her hair, her age, her peace. And for the first time she said aloud, not to the house, not to the past, not to the echoes, but to herself. You made it. And the reflection so long feared smiled back. The snow stayed for weeks. Each morning, Carmen opened her curtains to a world transformed, quiet, white, untouched. The trees were still. The sky held a soft, pale gray that never quite let go of the sun, and her breath fogged the glass in perfect symmetry. She moved slower now, not from age, but because there was no rush anymore. Somewhere deep in her bones, the tension she'd once carried, the silent bracing, the readiness for whispers, for chill, for doors that moved without hands, had unspooled completely. She no longer lived with the expectation of haunting, only with the memory of it, and even that had softened. One afternoon, she found herself in the attic, not searching, just wandering the way people do when the past no longer frightens them. Dust floated in golden light from the single window, and the wooden floor creaked beneath her careful steps. In the far corner beneath a folded blanket was a cardboard box she didn't remember packing. Inside were photographs, not just of her children or the house, but of that time. The days of the haunting, faces frozen in worry, Polaroids with shapes she had once sworn were evidence, scraps of newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Southington Family Claims House was former funeral home. She held one of the photos to the light. It showed her standing on the front porch of the house on Meriden Avenue. The window behind her reflected something blurry, something she had once feared. But now all she saw was a woman trying her best to hold a world together. She whispered softly to the version of herself in the photo, "You did." She placed the box back exactly where she'd found it and left it unopened. There was nothing left in it she needed. That evening, she lit the fireplace and sat in her old armchair, the manuscript on her lap. Not to edit, not to relive, just to feel it in her hands. She turned to the final page and wrote one more line. Closure isn't silence. It's knowing that what lived in the walls no longer lives in you. Then she closed the book and laid it beside her. Outside, the wind brushed gently against the house, not knocking, not testing, just passing by. And Carmen, with her eyes half closed and her hands folded in her lap, whispered into the hush, "You may go." Not a command, a permission. And from somewhere deeper than the earth, deeper than the basement, deeper than memory itself, something exhaled. The exhale, if it was even real, did not move the curtains. It did not flicker the fire. It did not echo down the hallway or rise through the floorboards. But Carmen felt it, not in the room, in her ribs, a loosening. The last thread in a fabric too long stretched by fear, finally letting go. There was no pop, no jolt, no sharp ending. Just a hush, like the pause after a bell stops ringing where the sound is gone. But your body still remembers. That night, sleep came like snowfall, slow, gentle, silent. She dreamed of nothing, and when she woke, the world was still blanketed in white. Days passed gently. One evening, while preparing dinner, she reached into her cabinet for a jar of rosemary. When she pulled it down, a small envelope slipped out from behind it, fluttering onto the counter. Her breath caught not in panic, but in curiosity. The envelope was old, yellowed at the corners, tied shut with a faded green ribbon. She untied it. Inside, one photo, one note. The photo was grainy black and white, clearly decades old. It showed a man in a mortician's coat, the cold room, the metal table. But this time, something was different. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down at a small boy holding his hand, both of them smiling. She turned the photo over. In the same soft script as the others, he found his way out. So did I. Carmen pressed the photo to her chest and closed her eyes. She remembered that version of the cold room, the sterile one, the shadowed one, the place that reeked of formality and forgotten grief. But now she could also see this, a warmth, a moment of peace. Two figures, one lost, one left behind, finally walking towards something other than sorrow. She placed the photo in her cedar chest atop the manuscript, not to lock it away, but to keep it safe. That night, as the fire crackled low and her tea cooled in its cup, Carmen stood at the threshold of her back porch. The snow had stopped falling. The stars were out quiet and distant. She stepped outside barefoot in the snow just long enough to whisper, "All stories end." A gust of wind passed through the trees, rustling nothing. Then stillness. Carmen lingered for a moment more, then went back inside, closed the door, and for the first time in her life, locked it not out of fear, but because it was finally time. The door clicked shut behind her with a sound that echoed deeper than it should have. Not loudly, not ominously, just final. Carmen stood in the entryway for a moment, hand still resting on the knob as though expecting something to rise up in protest. Some last ripple of unfinished business. One final echo before the house went quiet forever. But there was only the creak of her old floorboards under her feet. No footsteps in return, no breath down the hallway. She smiled. The next morning she awoke to sunlight pooled across her pillow. Pale gold, quiet and clean. A light that didn't cut it warmed. For a long time she lay there, not moving, simply letting it touch her. She thought of everything that had led her here. The house on Meriden Avenue, the cold room, the boy who whispered through walls, the mortician with blurred features and a scalpel in hand. All of it. And the woman she had become, not in spite of it, but because of it. After breakfast, she returned to the cedar chest one final time. Inside the manuscript, rested exactly where she left it. Beneath the photo, the dried lily, the stone. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Instead, she retrieved a bundle of kindling from beside the hearth and built a small, careful fire, not for warmth, for farewell. She knelt before the flames and held the manuscript in her lap, her fingers resting on the cover like saying goodbye to an old friend. Then with reverence she fed it page by page into the fire. No rush, no guilt, no fear. Each sheet curled, darkened, and lifted into the flue like smoke rising from a prayer. The photo followed. The lily, the note from the boy, even the feather, each offering taken not with violence but grace. When the fire had dimmed to a bed of glowing embers, Carmen sat back, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She felt lighter, not empty, unburdened. She stepped out onto the porch once more that evening, as the sky turned lavender and the first stars blinked into being. In the distance, the town moved on cars, laughter music drifting faintly from someone's open window, and within her, stillness, not silence forced by fear, stillness chosen, earned. A small breeze lifted her hair and passed without weight, without message, the kind that carries nothing, the kind that asks nothing. She closed her eyes and whispered, "You're not mine anymore, and I am not yours." The house behind her stayed quiet, not listening, just resting. And Carmen, after so many years, so many echoes, so many cold breaths and long nights and unread pages, finally stepped inside and shut the door, with nothing waiting on the other side. The final morning came quietly wrapped in fog and the gentle hush of snowfall melting under the early sun. Carmen rose without alarm, without ache. just a soft, steady breath as light filtered through the curtains. Outside, the world was damp and silver trees dripping from their branches, like they too were letting go. She dressed slowly, wrapped herself in her shawl, and brewed one last cup of tea. The house was warm, not from the fire, she hadn't lit one in days, but from something simpler, something earned. The kind of warmth that comes when every memory in a room has been met and named, and none are hiding anymore. She walked through each room one final time. In the kitchen, she ran her fingers over the old wooden table still nicked from years of plates and elbows and hurried mornings. In the hallway, she paused by the mirror, not to look behind herself, but to smile at the woman who stood there now. Her shoulders weren't as straight. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes had become something else entirely. Clear, rooted, done. She passed the window at the end of the hallway, the one that used to make her pause in dread. She opened it wide. No wind rushed in, no cold, just air, clean and quiet. In her bedroom, the fan was already on. She lay down, one hand resting gently on her chest, the other curled beneath her cheek. The candle on her nightstand was unlit. She hadn't lit it in weeks. She didn't need to. The fan hummed its steady lullaby. The room dimmed slowly as the fog outside thickened, wrapping the house in a soft veil of soundlessness. And in that gentle space between wakefulness and sleep, Carmen whispered her final words to the house, to the story, to the shadows that once lingered. Rest well, and somewhere far away, perhaps in Southington, perhaps in memory, an old door creaked open just enough to let the light in, not because someone was coming, but because there was nothing left to fear. You've made it to the end of tonight's journey. Thank you for staying. This story, like so many others we carry quietly in the dark, wasn't about fear. It was about what fear leaves behind. The impressions, the echoes, the silence. And sometimes it's not the haunting that matters. It's who chooses to stay and listen. Carmen didn't escape the past. She stayed with it, sat beside it, let it speak. And when it was done, she folded it gently and let it go. Not because she had to forget, but because she finally understood that not every ghost wants to be banished. Some just want to be remembered. Maybe that's true for us too. So if you find yourself haunted by something, an old memory, a place you can't forget, a voice that still lingers, don't rush to shut it out. Sit with it a while. Breathe with it. Let it become part of you in a way that softens, not sharpens. And when it's ready, it'll leave. Or maybe it'll stay quietly, respectfully as part of your story. But it won't hurt anymore. It'll just be. Now, as the night deepens and the last candle fades, let your body rest. Let your breath slow. Let the past slip gently behind you like the closing of a well-loved book. Because the haunting is over now. The story has been told. And you are safe.